Hi class. So one of our main focuses this week is to think about analyzing our audiences and how do we create communications, documents, etc. that really meet the needs of those audiences and also try to serve our own purposes effectively. So our textbook really starts outlining a few different things in relation to this. They say that projects succeed when you have an accurate understanding of the audience and a clear purpose. And I think it's important in terms of thinking about audiences in this course to make sure that you're not just thinking about me as the audience. In every single type of assignment I give you, I'm going to give you an in-depth case and ask you to respond to the people in those cases. So it's important not to just think of me as the audience, because your communications aren't going to succeed if they only are written for me. At the same time, you do always want to have a clear purpose in your documents. So what do you hope to achieve in those documents? What are your goals? And it's important to try and make sure that documents fulfill those. Then the textbook also says that there are 4 important characteristics of the audience. Who are the readers? Why are they reading the document? What are their attitudes and expectations? And how will they use the document? So I think we can go ahead and look at the FIU English website as perhaps an example of how we can consider some of these questions. Websites are probably a little bit tricky a lot of the time in analyzing audiences because there's going to be a lot of different people who can access it. Since it's a public document, since it's a public site, there's going to be a wide range of people who will be accessing it, and they'll be accessing it for different readers. So trying to understand who might be the readers first is an important thing. And I feel like also I can criticize this site a little bit because we are working on a revision of it. So all of my criticisms are things that we're considering about already in terms of trying to improve it. So, first of all, who might be the readers of this site? Well, potential students are likely readers, current students who are trying to get some more information about programs and courses they can take. People from other institutions might be reading it in order to try and understand a little bit more about our program. This is often the case when someone's trying to apply to a program or when they're trying to work with somebody about it. Other parts of our institution outside of the English department, so other departments within FIU might be reading it in order to get information about current events or people in it, or for administrative reasons in order to try and improve it. So that's a little bit about who our readers are and why they might be reading it. Their attitudes and expectations are probably going to vary by a lot, but they are going to generally have the expectation that it looks like it's part of the FIU site as a whole, and that it allows them to find the information that they need relatively quickly. And that it does so through different links. So this is one of the standard elements of websites that it's all built upon the idea that you can link from one section to the other and find information easily. And how will they use it? Well, they're going to be reading it. Some people might even be printing out certain elements. So when I was applying and interviewing here at FIU, I was printing out some of these things in order to just try and understand and have a reference document on what the different courses were like at FIU. So they're going to be reading it online as well. Some people might be needing to use it in different ways. So this is part of where the drive towards universal design and accessibility comes from, that not everyone's going to be reading it using the same types of technologies. They might be needing to use screen readers. They might be needing to use other methods of really engaging with the site. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. The textbook also tells us to consider 6 factors about each of our most important readers: their educational backgrounds, their professional experience, their job responsibility, their cultural characteristics, their personal characteristics, and their reading, speaking, and listening preferences. So again, we're going to have a wide variety in this case, but in a lot of other communications, it's going to be much more direct and much more simple to try and analyze some of these audiences. So educational background. Well, for example, one of our audiences might be high school students who are considering majoring in English at FIU. In that case, their educational background is probably, high school education, but they have taken some English classes in high school. They are interested in English if they're considering this as their major. So they've probably taken a little bit more English than, or a little bit more advanced English even perhaps than the average high school student. Their professional experience, they are, if we want to consider being a student as a professional experience, I think we should in this case, that they've probably encountered these types of websites, that they are trying to understand the structure of the learning program here, and they are being able to compare it to other sites that are similar, that are also probably applying to those institutions. Cultural characteristics, these might differ depending on what culture your readers are coming from. This is especially important in international communications, where you might have readers who are very diverse and have a lot of different expectations on what politeness looks like and what formality looks like, and how do you create websites that are effective for those people. And if you actually start looking around some of the international websites, some sites that are created for international audiences, you're going to see things that are different than those that are created for primarily American audiences. And I just would suggest going out and looking at some of that, because it can be really interesting to see sites that are built for Chinese audiences and Indian audiences, and a lot of audiences that have different expectations on how these are structured. Personal characteristics we can kind of skip over for right now. This one's really important if you have it directed at a smaller audience and you can really identify what the personal characteristics are. So for example, I often write to my research collaborator Ellen, and she really prefers formal communications, and she's kind of engaged in these more formal communications for a long time. So I have a much higher level of formality in my communication to her than I do to other colleagues of mine who might not have that type of personal characteristic and expectation. And then finally, reading, speaking, and listening preferences. One of these things here that we should pay attention to is how much graphics to use, how do you support communications through images. And that's another thing that we're going to be paying attention to, because not all communication really is going to be textual. In fact, one thing that you might look at our website and say is that we might need to do more with the visual elements here, because our visual elements are a little bit limited, and that's actually one of the major things we are addressing in the rewrite. Finally, classify your readers into 3 categories: a primary audience, a secondary audience, and a tertiary audience. So the first thing that you should pay attention to, and probably the most important one in most cases, is that primary audience. They are the people to whom the communication is directed. So when you're writing a memo to a particular organization or person, when you're writing a letter to a particular person, that's going to be your primary audience, who you're directly addressing it to. But they're not the only audience that you need to consider. There are secondary audiences, people who will not directly act on or respond to the document, but need to be aware of it. So sometimes these are going to be people who are copied in emails, people who need to have access to and be able to look at reports, who might be only really engaging in certain parts of the report, but they're not going to necessarily you're never going to see responses directly from them so much, but it's something that where they need to be able to understand what's in the document, and they need to be able to see it too. And then tertiary audiences, other people who might be interested in that document, other people who it might affect in different ways. And those audiences can include people who are affected by the primary and secondary audiences. So if you have a new rule within the workplace that really gets implemented by a limited range of people, but affects other people who might not be as directly related to that. The tertiary audiences are those other people who might have a more limited range of interaction with it. There might be people that who you're not interacting with quite as directly, but sometimes, so for another example is you might have an email that's being sent to a colleague, but that email becomes part of a record that then can be pulled up at later times, and so you're not directly creating that communication for this tertiary audience, but they're still important to consider in how you're going to be forming that communication. So hopefully this helps you a little bit in thinking about just all of the different aspects of audience and how complex it can sometimes become. But that's going to be one of the things that we're going to be engaging with a lot more this week, and I'm going to be asking you to do a lot more with analyzing audience.